Hi, good morning. It's so cold this morning. I love it. It's so nice. I got in my car and it said 61. I'm like, that's 50 degrees colder than it was like a few days ago. I almost was cold, but I'll take that. I'll take that any day over 111. There was a day, I think it's like Tuesday of next week. It's only supposed to be 72 as the high. I got way too excited for that. We went to Disneyland yesterday and it was like 96 and it was so hot. So I'm very excited for 60s and 70s. Even 80s seems cold compared to 111, right? Anyway, I had another thought just left me. Now I'm thinking about churros from yesterday. I ate way too many churros at Disneyland, but it was a good day. It was a good day when you get to eat like 6 churros and spend like $80 on churros yesterday. Wanted to remind you of something. I'm gonna put it up on the board over there. Our first little part of our paper is due. I'll talk about it at the end, but it's due on Monday. It's the paper part one. Here, let me make sure that you're getting that for 10 points. Due Monday. On the canvas. And as I said, I'll talk about it a little bit more at the end. But I'm gonna put it up here just to kind of keep it on your mind. And then try and remember to give you a little bit more at the end of our class about it. Because that is coming up. We also have our first exam coming up too. So we got a couple of things coming up just to kind of keep on your mind, but not quite yet. And again, I'll talk about that more at the end today. What we'll do for now is we'll jump back into where we were last time. Right, we were talking about phobias and what causes them. We watched the video of flooding. And as I said, I had another video for you, but I didn't want to like cram it into our last 3-4 minutes. So if you remember Jackie, who had the fear of feathers and birds, there's a really cool kind of hybrid of these two. Pretty common, rather than doing something really drastic like flooding, where you make someone have such a massive exposure, there might be a treatment where you have them face their fear head on, but in like a normal amount. And so what I'm going to show you is an example of very like cognitive behavioral therapy, where they do a little bit of kind of a blending of the two. And she makes a lot of progress. It takes some time, but it's one like really long session, and she makes a lot of progress from it. So I think it's a really great way of looking at how to face a fear in therapy through a more like traditional way, because flooding, obviously a very dramatic procedure. This is a little more kind of grounded in something more possible and doable. So let me play Heather, which is huge for her, right? The fact that she can actually hold on to it is a really big piece of progress. So it's kind of like combining these two a little bit. It's more traditional cognitive behavioral therapy of pushing her, but not as dramatic or drastic as flooding, where it's not like difficult to do. And a lot of people face their fears through therapy in some way. Phobias, again, no different, but we can do it very slowly and gradually, very quickly and dramatically, or some kind of hybrid of the two, depending on your preference. Again, none of these would be things you would enter into without like a big conversation with a therapist ahead of time. Are there any other like stories or comments or thoughts about phobias before we move away from them? How many of you would be willing to face your phobia through like one of these methods? Would anyone be willing to? You're like, no? No.
I mean, considering I just did like the ropes course at CSUN earlier in the year, I'm like, never again.
Our height's not a big,
Yeah,
not a big
I could do flying, but like as long as I'm like legit strapped in,
Uh-huh.
like in a close space, like I'm fine. But just
yeah.
when I could easily free fall, like nope.
It's scary to face something you're afraid of, right? Like it's not something I don't think very many people would be excited to do. Would anyone be willing to do one of them? Yeah, how about this? If you had to pick, would you rather go slow and steady and like progressively get there, or flooding, right? How many of you would choose flooding out of show of hands? Just rip the Band-Aid off. Several of you. How about systematic desensitization? I'm kind of split in the middle. Interesting. I mentioned a moment ago, we went to Disneyland yesterday, and my oldest is terrified of roller coasters. I was just thinking about that with the picture up here. Absolutely terrified of roller coasters. And my youngest is like a roller coaster junkie, right? So they're like complete opposite ends of the spectrum. And so my youngest and I rode like the Incredicoaster in California Adventures like 3 times back to back to back to back. And my oldest was like, no, like just absolutely terrified. But at the end of the day, we were about to leave and she's like, I kind of have a regret. And I was like, what's that? And she's all like, I kind of want to ride a roller coaster. I was like, name it, let's go. Like, let's go now, right? And I was like, we got to ride that moment, right? Every pun intended. And so we went and she's like, I want to ride. I was like, which one do you want to ride? And she's like, Thunder Mountain. Like, okay, great, let's do it. That's my favorite ride at Disneyland. And so we went over and she like was in tears. But she's like, I really want to do it. Just make me do it. And so she's next to my partner because everyone always chooses my partner, but that's okay. I think every ride, we have 5 of us, so I'm always the odd one out, but that's all right. I'm not sad about it or anything. So we go on the ride and she rides with my partner. She's literally crying the whole time. We ended, she's like, can we go again? Okay, like we rode it 5 times. I would say it was almost flooding for her. And at the end of the day, she was all like, when are we gonna come back? I want to try Space Mountain. I was like, oh, I want to come back too. Let's go. So it was kind of cool. My daughter yesterday like pushed herself with no prompting. Like I don't ever push her. And she like at the end of the day like flooded herself. So again, you can do these things on your own. And thankfully it went well for her and it was a positive experience. But they're challenging things to do. Again, if you're afraid of something, it's not always the most fun to face it, but lots of ways to do that. So I might have to plan another trip to Disneyland soon, right? So that we can ride the next level of roller coaster. Anyway, the next one, panic attacks. This is another really common anxiety disorder. Panic attacks are very intense but short-lasting experiences. Anyone in here ever had a panic attack before? Right? Quite a few of you, myself included, they can be scary. Anyone, a lot of you raised your hand. Anyone want to kind of describe what was that like for you? Anything like to describe it or share it? Right? A lot of you raised your hand. Yeah.
I got like extreme tunnel vision in the moment.
Yeah.
Tuning everything. It was really weird. It was almost as if like I could hear or like see anything around. So it was kind of like, in the moment.
Yeah. It's really common that it's like the whole world stops to exist. It's just your like immediate like surroundings or immediate experience. Anyone else? Other stuff? Yeah.
This like so overwhelming that I was having a heart attack.
Yeah.
And I went to the hospital.
Mhm.
They really said it.
Just right. And that's really common. A lot of people end up in the hospital because they think they're having a heart attack because it can be such an intense experience and your heart is pounding out of your chest. It can feel like a panic attack or like a heart attack. Anybody else? Anything else with them? Those are really good descriptions. They're overwhelming, right? A couple of criteria, let's write them up here. But just one distinction here. So you can have a panic attack is one time. Okay? But people can also develop what's called panic disorder. And with panic disorder, you're having recurrent panic attacks. And then you start fearing that you'll have them. And that causes you a lot of anxiety as well. So sometimes when people have one, it creates this fear that they're going to have more of them. And it can start to create like an ongoing issue, even if they've only ever had one. So it can be one attack or it can be a disorder where you have reoccurring attacks. So
Yeah. I've never tried the whole breathing into the bag thing. Is that just to like regulate your breaths or like
yeah, so the idea behind it is, so there's this whole idea about like the carbon monoxide of it. More than anything, it's the focused breathing, right? So there isn't a whole lot of support to that idea in terms of the way it's meant to work. But the idea is like almost like a mindfulness of like you're focusing on the bag popping and the breathing, and it takes your mind off of the panic. Which you could accomplish without the bag. So the bag itself doesn't necessarily help, but it's a very common idea, which is why I put it up there. So you can do that without it, just focusing on your breath can accomplish the same thing. Right? So panic attacks, let's look at some symptoms of these. Panic attacks. So in order to be diagnosed as having a panic attack, you have 4 or more of the following. So 4+ symptoms. And they reach a peak typically within about 10 minutes. And that's not a hard rule, but we usually say within a matter of minutes. And then they tend to subside after that. Now, not to say that you might not be exhausted the entire day after having a panic attack, but it tends to be kind of a shorter lasting experience. So people have heart palpitations. Your heart is pounding out of your chest. You mentioned you thought you were having a heart attack. So common, right? It happens all the time. People go into the emergency room because their heart is just literally pounding. It won't calm down. It's beating very, very, very quickly. People start sweating, trembling or shaking. And again, all of these physiological symptoms that are a result of all of those neurotransmitters and hormones coursing through your system. People have shortness of breath. You might feel you're choking or you can't swallow. Another really common thing that people experience, there's quite a few: chest pain, nausea, dizziness. Right, all of these things are caused by, again, all of those neurotransmitters coursing through your body. There's a fear of losing control. Or even a sense of like impending death. People oftentimes think they're going to die, which causes more panic, right? If you feel like you're having a heart attack and you feel like you're going to die, it only fuels that panic cycle and it can make it harder and harder to get out of. One more thing that's really common, and it's kind of like you were mentioning, people get what's called derealization. And that's almost like what you were talking about with the tunnel vision, right? Everything else feels far away. It's almost like you're separated from reality around you. It can feel very much like you're detached from yourself. That's another thing that happens for people. You can also add chills and hot flashes. A lot of physiological symptoms. And all of these, again, kind of reach a peak within a matter of moments, and then they tend to subside, though the after effects of it can last for quite some time. And so if people have one panic attack, they have just a panic attack, a singular incident, or you can have the disorder where you have multiple ones. And there's a really interesting phobia that sometimes comes with panic disorder. And enough so that we often diagnose it as with or without agoraphobia. Agoraphobia is an interesting phobia. It has a lot of facets to it. But one of the elements that relates here is people start to get afraid to go out into the world because they're afraid that they'll have a panic attack and not be able to get to a place of safety, right? And so oftentimes people who have severe panic disorder won't leave their house because they're afraid they'll have a panic attack out in the world and it'll only create more panic. They won't be able to escape it. It can also be kind of intense fears of crowds or not being able to escape, right? And so it kind of multiple facets to it, but as it relates to panic disorder, it's fear of being separated from a source of security. And so people become like reclusive. They stay in their home and they don't go out because if they have a panic attack, then they're home and they have that safety to fall back on. Yeah.
What's like an example of derealization? And how could that like really occur?
Sure. So kind of like he was describing, right? It's almost like tunnel vision. The world around you, reality, right? I think about like the reality piece of it. Reality fades away and you're only focused on like your own experience. So it's almost like the world around you doesn't exist. He described it as tunnel vision. So almost like things narrow in and you're not aware of the world around you anymore. It's something that happens with this and also with some of the stress and trauma disorders that we'll talk about in the next chapter.
I thought that was just like the withdrawal symptoms, so that's why I find it like interesting.
Yeah.
And that's
And it can be a withdrawal symptom, right? Or like a symptom that's brought on by some drugs can cause like derealization or depersonalization. But it's something that happens here. It's almost like everything fades around you and you have almost like a hyper awareness of only your experience. And it's almost like the world around you doesn't exist. Yeah. Yeah. I think that's a really good way of putting it. Any other thoughts or questions or comments or anything? It's really interesting how many kids' movies recently have featured panic attacks, right? I was talking about this with my kids. I was like preparing for class. And my daughter was like, oh, there's this movie and this movie and this movie. She's like, Puss in Boots, Last Wish. He has a panic attack, right? Chase in Paw Patrol has a panic attack in the Paw Patrol movie. And then obviously Inside Out 2 has a panic attack. And I'm going to show you that one. But there's so many examples of panic attacks in kids' media recently. It's something that I think is kind of growing in awareness. So let me show you an example of this. And as I mentioned, there are quite a few examples of this, but I think this is a good one of this in film, but I think that one's a really good one, along with some of the other ones that I mentioned, but it can feel like that, and it tends to be a very short-term, short-lasting experience. But with a lot of exhaustion, sometimes people feel like they have to go to sleep afterward because they're so worn out from it. Anything else here before we move on? In terms of causes and treatment, two big perspectives, biological and cognitive, right? Those have come up a couple of times here in this chapter so far. But biologically, panic attacks and panic disorders can be a little bit genetic, right? They can run in families. But a lot of it is thought to be due to the neurotransmitter norepinephrine. So norepinephrine and the areas of the brain like the locus coeruleus that control and release a lot of our norepinephrine are thought to have some abnormalities. And if that's the case, then we can give people medications to reduce and change the norepinephrine levels. That's a very common way to target panic attacks. And it could be that people are given a medication if they feel like one is happening or one's about to happen, that they take it at that point. Or maybe even take something like an antidepressant to work on norepinephrine on more like a more consistent basis. So there are some biological elements to this, but another big part of it is the cognitive perspective, right? Getting people to understand what's happening, right? So when you feel like you're having a panic attack, the panic builds and builds and builds. And so rather than fueling that, understanding, okay, this is what's happening in my body. I understand what's happening. I know it's going to pass, right? And learning some of the ways to like breathe and deal with that, lowering somebody's anxiety sensitivity. Everybody is different in their level of anxiety that they can handle. And people who have panic attacks might be more likely to focus on those bodily sensations, interpret them as harmful. If you feel like you're having a heart attack and you're going to die, it's going to create more panic and more anxiety. So how can we get you to understand what's happening and then reduce those misinterpretations, learn to breathe, learn to be mindful, learn to be in the moment? Very common activity or practice for this is doing something called a calm place meditation or a safe space meditation. I've heard it both ways, where maybe you have a place that you picture in your mind that's very peaceful and calm for you. And when you feel something like this coming on, you close your eyes and try and put yourself in that space to calm yourself down, right? Distraction can sometimes be enough as well, right? Like if you can distract someone, you can sometimes pull them out of their head enough to stop a panic attack from escalating. So a lot of like cognitive stuff and then medication can also sometimes be helpful, right? Depending on how severe, how often the panic attacks are occurring. Anything else with these questions, thoughts, comments, anything else so far? So before we get to the next one, which is OCD, I want to talk for just a minute about superstitions. Feels like a good time of the year for superstitious beliefs, right? As we are kind of nearing mid-September here. Superstitions are beliefs or practices usually surrounding luck or prophecy or sometimes spiritual beings. It's this idea that one thing can influence another, even when they're often completely unrelated, right? So what a day keeps the doctor away? An apple, right? Step on what and break what? Break your mother's back usually, right? I remember as a kid being mad at my mom and be like, every crack I could find, right? Step on it. Good luck to carry a rabbit's foot, bad luck to walk under a ladder, bad luck to break a mirror, and black water, bad luck. I have two of them, so I'm in trouble, right? Black cats are bad luck. There are so many superstitious beliefs. right? Friday the 13th is another really like, it's scary one. What is that for?
Especially this week.
Isn't it, is it this week?
Yeah.
Oh, wow, and then we have one in October, don't we? Is it December? Okay, I was thinking there was one coming. You're right, it's Wednesday. I'm off by a day. Oh, that's fun. I always think Friday the 13th is a good day to watch like scary movies, right? But a lot of people have very like negative superstitious beliefs about the number 13. Judas was the 13th guest at the Last Supper. There's a lot of like very like superstitious thinking behind it. What are some other superstitions? Anyone have one that you know of or that you follow? Yeah.
When the LA Kings won their 2014 cup, like we had this like Easter bunny jar thing.
Okay.
We placed in a specific spot every single time just to win. the
Yeah.
game. So
Yeah.
if we didn't have this,
We're gonna win.
Yeah.
And sports and athletes are very superstitious, right? If you ever have played a sport or watched sports, athletes have a lot of like ritualistic behaviors that if they don't do, they feel like things are gonna go poorly. Like it's really interesting. Athletes and performances, like people who do stuff like that, it's really common. Yeah. Yeah, right. Knocking on wood, right? Like, oh, you better knock on wood, right? So that you don't curse it. You're calling upon the good spirits that were thought to live within wood, right? Within trees within the habit wood. And when you knock on it 3 times, you call forth the good spirits to bring you good luck and good fortune. What are some other ones? Anyone else have other superstitious beliefs, things that you know of or follow or have heard? Other ones? Anyone, I always have what about the throw the salt over your shoulder, right? When you spill the salt, you have to throw it over your shoulder. Common belief, right? And the thought with that one is that evil spirits lurk behind you because it was bad luck to spill salt because it was expensive in the early days of like having salt being available. So you throw salt over your shoulder to blind the demon that's lurking behind you to bring you bad fortune. Right? Again, things we don't tend to think about when we knock on wood or we throw salt over our shoulder. Anyone have any other ones? Anybody else? How about bless you when someone sneezes, right? We just say it, bless you, right? You were going to die of the plague. When people sneezed, we said, God bless you because you're about to die, right? It was like, oh, good luck on your journey to the afterlife because it's coming, right? And so now we say it as bless you without tending to think about that. Knocking on wood, we said that one. What about, trying to think of other ones. It's bad luck to say good luck to someone who's about to perform, right? You have to say break a leg instead, if anyone in here is like into theater, or you don't mention Macbeth, right? There's all these like superstitious beliefs that people have, and they're really, really common. And there's nothing wrong with superstition, but it can kind of escalate and get out of control. And as I mentioned, very common with athletes. Next time you're watching like baseball or basketball or any of those, like those two are probably the best examples. When somebody goes up to take like a free shot, the number of times they like flip the ball or like dribble the ball or touch certain parts of their body, they have like ritualistic behaviors that they do. Or someone goes up to bat, the number of times they unvelcro and velcro their glove or swing their bat or step in and out of the box. Those are all like rituals that they have that if they don't do them, it's not going to go well, right? And again, nothing wrong with doing that, but you can get caught up in it and it can go too far, right? And when people kind of get overwhelmed with superstitious thinking, it's very along the lines of OCD, obsessive compulsive disorder. And we all have a little bit of this disorder. Again, we all have a little bit of every disorder. But with this, we have kind of disturbing thoughts that lead us to senseless rituals. So people have an anxiety-driven thought that causes them to perform a behavior, typically over and over again, to try and get rid of that anxiety. So maybe you have to wash your hands a certain number of times in order to rid yourself of the fear that your hands are contaminated. Really common one that came up during COVID. Very like checking behavior is common. Like maybe you have to check that you turned off the stove or you turned off the coffee pot or whatever it might be. But you have these kind of obsessive thoughts leading to behaviors. And again, we all have a degree of this. Like every night before I go to bed, every single night, I go check my front door. I go check to make sure it's locked, right? I do it every night. And I don't think there's anything wrong with that. I'm just making sure before I go to sleep. I would even say if I check it twice, that's not abnormal. Right, because I'm just making sure, what if I forgot or I didn't really check the door and whatnot. But let's say I go check it and I start getting into a habit where I have to lock it and unlock it a couple of times to make sure it's really locked. And then I go lay down in bed and I can't sleep because I'm not sure I actually locked it. I'm not sleeping at night and I have to get up and go check it multiple times. Then I've gone beyond kind of like the normal into more like obsessive compulsive sort of behavior. So again, a little bit of this is normal, but when it starts to take up your time and interfere with your life, then it transitions to more of a disorder. Yeah.
That knowledge, just being distracted.
How do you mean?
Mine's a little off, something like often home, lock the door, lock the room, gotta go to bed, and then I locked it. Like you're saying, but I just wasn't present in the moment, so
Sure.
it's just such a habit to do it.
Yeah, so maybe you do it once or twice. That's normal, right? But if you're not sleeping and you're laying there in bed so worried that you didn't lock the door or you didn't lock it properly, or you get in that habit of like you have to unlock it and lock it multiple times in a certain like way, when it starts to take up time and interfere with like your sleep or your daily routine, then it hits the point of being a disorder.
People say it's like, oh, my OCD is kicking in, but like that's just like they want everything to be perfect.
Sure.
Along the same lines.
It could be, yeah, and really confusing, but there's a disorder called OCPD that we'll talk about later in the semester. And that's more like obsession with things being perfect and just so. And they're very similar, but a little bit different. We'll talk about that one later. But yeah, if you want, like you get focused on things being a certain way, like that could be part of this. But we all have that to a degree. Again, it's once it starts to interfere. And I'm going to show you an example in a moment. And I think when it's really obvious, you can see it. But there obviously is kind of a whole spectrum here. So it can get tricky to identify. But the idea here again is you have these obsessions, the negative thoughts or impulses that feel out of your control. And then you have the compulsions, which are the behaviors that you perform in a very like repetitive, ritualistic sort of way. So people have like a thought of contamination and then they have to wash their hands a certain number of times, or a thought of something bad's going to happen. And so then you perform a behavior. I had a student, this was like 3 years ago, I want to say, turn back on in a moment. I had a student who would get up and leave my class like 5, 6 times a class. And I didn't ask. I was curious, but I didn't ask. Right? And she would get up, she'd be gone for like 4 or 5 minutes, and she'd come back all sweaty half the time, and looking kind of panicked. I never asked her what was going on. Right? And then we got to this section, and after class, she came up to me and she's like, have you ever wondered where I go during class? And I was like, yes. Like, are you going to tell me? Like, I was so curious. And she's like, I go out to my car. Just keep doing that. She's like, I go out to my car and I check to make sure it's locked. I was like, so you go all the way out to the parking lot 6 times a class, 5 times a class? And she's like, yeah, I'm convinced it's unlocked and someone's going to steal my car and then I won't have a way to get home. And so every time, like literally 4, 5, 6 times in an hour and 15 minutes, she would leave, go check her car and come back. Right. And I told her, I was all like, all right, next class, I'm not going to let you do it. And she didn't show up the next class. I felt so mean, right? She was clearly all anxious. But she showed up the class after that and she sat there the whole time and she was like tapping and sweating and looked horrible. And I felt so mean, but she stopped doing it just by me telling her I wasn't going to let her do it. I was like, if you go to do it, I'm going to call you out in front of everyone. And I thought it was being brilliant, but I caused her so much anxiety. But it broke it for her, which was amazing in the end. But it's that idea of like the obsessive thought was like, my car isn't locked and someone's going to steal it. And the compulsion was leaving class to go check it and lock it and come back. And again, like you might once, right? Like you might sit here and go like, oh, I'm not sure I locked my car, and it's on your mind, but you don't maybe do anything about it. Or maybe you go once to double check, but 5, 6 times that's interfering. You're missing the class that's causing you anxiety that you can't sit with. We've crossed over into a different like realm. Anyone in here know someone with OCD? Any like comments or stories, people in your life or anything? Yeah.
It's like, for my mom, like, whenever she always drove to work, like, she always called the house or any of us just to make sure the garage door is closed every single day. And I'm just like, You don't need a word.
I'll close the garage, right? Did it go beyond that or was it just the garage door? Was it multiple things or was it just that?
I don't remember.
Huh, yeah, cause again, like, one phone call to make sure you lock the door. Kind of on the line, but let's say like they keep going home or they keep obsessing about it and it translates to other things. Then it starts to get a little more out of control, yeah. Mm-hmm. It,
Categorized as OCD, just have one problem.
it could be either, right? So it could be one thing, it could be just hand washing. Or it could be like multiple things and across certain like different dimensions. So you can have multiple obsessions and compulsions. They take up time. So oftentimes people don't have a ton of them. It's usually one or two things, but it could be multiple things. It definitely could be. Let me show you an example of what this can look like. So very common that new parents develop like OCD behaviors, right? Especially around, again, to the point where like her hands are bleeding and cracking, like that many times in an hour is just so excessive, right? And if it doesn't follow that certain ritual, she has to do it again. And then the fears like with her son, like it's pretty obvious in her case that it's taking up a lot of time. So that there's really only two main criteria. You have the presence of obsessions and compulsions, and those obsessions and compulsions take up a minimum of 1 hour a day, right? It can be quite a bit more than that. If it's severe for her, it's quite a bit more than that. And then we specify with this one, do people have good insight or poor insight, right? So like for her, she's very aware of it, but she can't stop it. And we'll watch her get treatment for that in a little bit. It's very behavioral in the way that they do it. But typically we focus on stopping the compulsions. Like with my student that I was telling you about, I wouldn't let her perform the compulsion of leaving the classroom. And that's challenging and difficult, but if you can break the cycle, then people tend to get better and they're able to kind of let it go a little bit. So again, you have these obsessive beliefs that lead to compulsive behaviors. And a couple of thoughts here, we talk a lot about like a Freudian perspective here. Now, there's not a lot of support for this. There's not a lot of support for Freud's ideas, period. But he did kind of propose some very radical ideas and was the first to do so. But he talked about OCD being rooted in toilet training or potty training. That if you were very severe and harsh with a child when they're potty training, that they could develop being anal retentive. Now, he meant that as they literally retain and hold on to their feces and refuse to go. But anal retentive things have to be just so. They have to be a certain way. You're very particular, right? So his thoughts about that were very like linked to potty training, and OCD could come from issues there. If we run with that, you have to go back and resolve those conflicts. Again, not a lot of support, but it was one of the first ideas to kind of be proposed for OCD. Much more supported and common is focusing on the compulsions, the behaviors. So behaviors become conditioned, right? When she washes her hands and nothing bad happens to Jake, it's been positively reinforced over and over and over again. And so by breaking that cycle through something called exposure and response prevention, we can start to treat and get rid of what's going on there. So the idea is you expose someone to whatever it is that causes them anxiety, but you don't let them perform the behavior to feel better, right? So you don't let your student go check their car. You don't let your mom call, or you don't pick up to answer about the garage door, right? You don't go lock the front door or check it multiple times. Now, the risk here is that something bad happens when you do that, and that would make it harder to overcome. But most of the time it goes smoothly. And it's a very powerful way of reconditioning. It takes some time, but you recondition those pathways in the brain, and it can help someone to kind of get over this a little bit better. Now, let me show you how they do this with Stephanie, the woman that we just watched. They do this with her through therapy, and you can see just the radical transformation that she makes by making her stop that cycle. And again, it causes people grief. They often cry, they're upset. It's almost like a form of flooding. You're facing that head on, but it can have such a drastic outcome if people are willing to do it. So let me show you what that will look like with her. You can get an idea of up and kind of, she can let him do that. Oftentimes what happens with this is it just gets reinforced so much through, like, you don't let things happen. And so the whole point of exposure and response prevention is you break that cycle, and it's difficult for people to do, but once you break it, it almost starts a ball rolling, and it can be really, really helpful. And pairing that with like cognitive stuff can be helpful too, right? So looking at her thoughts, what are the negative thoughts that you're having? What are the connections that you're making in your head? And are they grounded in reality? Right. And so looking on what is maintaining those obsessions, what is maintaining those compulsions, and the thoughts and expectations that certain things are going to happen. Right. So what is the worst that could happen? What is the likely outcome of what will happen, and so on. And then sometimes even medication. Right. So they mentioned that she was on Prozac. Antidepressants can be really helpful for OCD because they work on serotonin and they work on norepinephrine, which are two different neurotransmitters that play a role in this. So sometimes people will take like a low dose of an antidepressant like Prozac or one of the SSRIs, which we'll talk more about in chapter 6. But they can take an antidepressant to help kind of increase the activity level in those two parts of the brain with that neurotransmitter. And that can sometimes play a role as well. So like for her, she was taking medication, doing exposure and response prevention, and it was really, really helpful for her. And so again, lots of treatments and lots of options to break the cycle to try and help make it a little bit better. Any other stories or thoughts or comments? Anything else with OCD? People in your life? Questions, thoughts, comments? Yeah?
So the norepinephrine,
Mhm.
the main, like the imbalance is like the main factor for this, or?
Yeah, norepinephrine and then serotonin to a secondary degree, but norepinephrine, right? And a lot of the SSRIs, the antidepressants, work on serotonin, norepinephrine, and dopamine. And so they tend to be pretty helpful for increasing the norepinephrine that people might have in a deficit.
Okay.
Yeah. Mhm.
The compulsions are only shown in this, disorder, because I know like people with autism, they have like
Rituals?
rituals,
Yeah.
where they have to like,
Mhm.
get rid of a certain way.
Sure.
I don't know if they're like presenting both, disorders or just like part of it.
So often when people are on the autistic spectrum, they do perform very like ritualistic behaviors, and that is a defining characteristic of spectrum. So you can have compulsions as part of multiple disorders. And with that one, it's more like ritualistic, and it's driven not so much by anxiety, but as like a self-soothing and calming. So you have to look at the whole picture of that, because autism is a very like broad developmental disorder, and so they typically present very different. There will be other things going on as well. We'll talk about ASD later. All right, one last kind of group of disorders here, OCD related disorders. So these are disorders that have things in common with OCD, or have like OCD like elements to them. And so people have these like repetitive behaviors, patterns of behaviors that disrupt their life. There's a few of them here, hoarding, trichotillomania, which is fun to say, but not fun to have, obviously, excoriation, and body dysmorphic disorder. So 4 different disorders here. Hoarding disorder used to be called being a pack rat. It's when people hold on to excessive amounts of things, even when they don't necessarily have any value, even when they might be like hazardous or unsanitary. Lots of TV shows about people who are hoarders, right? It's often very easy to see if someone is a hoarder, like when you walk into their home, or maybe even from the outside, depending on the severity of it. But people who are unable to get rid of stuff because it might have value or be needed at some point one day. Often very generational. We see it more in like people who are older, but it can be anyone. Right. People who have this disorder oftentimes pick up trash off the side of the road. They might not throw away a water bottle because that water bottle holds meaning for that day. It could be magazines that you'll never use again, right? It could be literally anything, but it's a disorder where people hold on to or hoard objects that are often worthless as a way to kind of hold on to and maintain whatever value they associate with them. It might be that they have tons of unopened packages in their house, or they're like bargain shoppers and they go out and buy a whole lot that they don't have money for and they hold on to it. Oftentimes very cluttered homes filled with stuff. And again, lots of TV shows related to this one. Trichotillomania or hair pulling disorder. People pull the hairs on their body in response to anxiety. And so it could be the hairs on your arm or your legs. It could be your hair on your head. It could be your eyelashes or eyebrows. It could be anywhere on your body. But in response to anxiety, people pull on hair on their body and oftentimes end up with large bald patches on their skin, on their scalp, wherever it might be. And it's very mindless. Like you might not even realize you're doing it. Like a lot of us have like mindless rituals. Like I tend to fix my collar a lot, right? Or like people will sometimes wring their hands. This can be like almost a mindless hair pulling, but it ends up having consequences of bald patches and pain, sometimes sores as the hair follicles get infected. It can be very damaging. Excoriation is super similar, but instead of pulling hair, you're picking at your skin. Right. And sometimes people pick at their skin mindlessly as well, but picking at scabs, picking at sores. Oftentimes people end up with infections because they're doing this so excessively, it can become a problem. And then this last one used to be somewhere else and they moved it here. I don't know if I like it here, but I'm not in charge of that. Body dysmorphic disorder. And I can see why they put it here, right? People have these thoughts that they're defective in some way. So they perform ritualistic behaviors of altering their appearance. And it might be multiple cosmetic surgeries, obsessive makeup procedures, but people think that some part of them is physically like defective or almost monstrous. And oftentimes like there's nothing obvious. It's all in their head. And I have an example of this. It was from like a Dr. Phil episode. Very dramatic, of course, but it's a good example. This young woman has body dysmorphic disorder and she OCD, right? Repetitive ritualistic behaviors. Okay. So all of these are very related to OCD in some way, but their own like unique spin. Before we run out of time for today, I just want to mention this so that you're thinking about it over the weekend. It's due on Monday. So due Monday, which is the 16th on Canvas. So remember that we have that character diagnosis paper, and there are 3 parts to it. So part 1 is worth 10 points, and you're turning it in on Canvas. So I'll remind you on Monday, because it's 11:59 p.m. on Monday, so you still have some time. But all it is on here is you're telling me which character you're doing for your paper. So start thinking about that over the weekend. Is there a movie or a TV show character or a video game character you really want to analyze? So you're gonna give me like a paragraph of who you're picking and why. So who and why. And then the citation information for your show. And it doesn't have to be in any particular format. I just want you to have it on there so you can use it later. So that if you're doing a character from Game of Thrones, for example, you're giving the citation information for the show, who produced it, when it was produced, the name of the show, and so on. You're submitting this on Canvas, but it's probably only about a paragraph plus the citation, right? It's really short. You can change your character at any time, but I want you to try and pick someone and commit to them, and that's the goal of this assignment. So think about it over the weekend. We'll talk about it again on Monday, but this is due on Monday, so definitely start giving it some thought if you haven't already. Okay. Have a wonderful rest of your week. Enjoy our cooler weather, and I will see you all on Monday.